Good afternoon. My name is Barrett Jones. I'm an adult reference librarian here at Ridgefield Library. I've been asked to introduce the man who needs no introduction, so it's pretty easy. Jack Sanders today, editor of Ridgefield Press for 45 years, author of numerous books of history of Ridgefield, and to me the keeper of the history of this town, truly a remarkable historian. I have an anecdote about Jack. When we were talking, this was a few months ago, he asked where I lived in Ridgefield. I mentioned this tiny street that's about a half a street long. And I think Jack knew 2 families. So that's the type of knowledge that Jack has among many things. History, as you are, those of you, and I'm sure you all are, readers of history, know that history is fluid and ever-changing, just as biology, computing, other fields. History, there's new histories coming out all the time, new views of histories, new information. Jack's research has given us a new chapter in the history of our town, a black history of Ridgefield, which we never really were aware of before. So this is important work of a scholar of our town, Jack Sanders.
Thank you all for braving the blizzard. I was hoping that we could keep the spring weather going another day, but I guess we're going to get back for at least 2 more days. It's supposed to be in the 50s later this week, so that's good. And as a speaker, I get to shed my mask. I hope nobody feels uncomfortable about it, but I'm pretty far away. Can everybody hear me? Is this the microphone on?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. Everybody in back can hear okay?
Yep.
Louder? Okay.
Louder.
Louder, a little louder.
Okay, I'll see if I can make it louder.
We're going to make it loud.
Get started though, while we'll fool around with the sound.
In 2019, the Hearst newspapers in Connecticut did a feature story about my research into a virtually unknown station on the Underground Railroad, operated by an African-American couple in Ridgefield. A few days later, I received a telephone call from a man who worked for a college in New Haven, inviting me to speak on a panel discussing black history. Whoops, that's a little louder. It seems that he had seen the newspaper story and was surprised by what he read. Not that there was a station in Ridgefield, which was what the story was about, but that the Underground Railroad existed in Connecticut. And I was amazed that a representative of a college in Connecticut, many of whose students were African American, was unaware that major Underground Railroad routes, using both land and sea, passed through Connecticut. In fact, a man at another New Haven college, who was the chairman of the social studies department there, had written a whole book on the subject called The Underground Railroad in Connecticut. However, Horatio Strother seemed to predict his 21st century collegiate colleagues' surprise. Even at the height of its operation, Strother wrote in 1962, the work of this railroad in Connecticut was shrouded in obscurity, and so it has remained. My own ignorance of Ridgefield's African American history helped spark my research. Despite 17 years of formal education, I found myself completely lacking in any sense of the lives and accomplishments of blacks in the 18th and 19th century America. And I knew almost nothing
about their early history in Ridgefield, a town about which I had been writing for at least 40 years. Worse, perhaps, was the fact that not a single one of the many histories, the written histories, published histories of the town, offered more than passing mention of black Ridgefielders. The starting point in this journey probably came when I noticed two surnames that stood out as unusual in the list of Revolutionary War veterans embossed on the War Memorial on Main Street. Among all the Bennetts, Keelers, Hawleys, Umsteads, and other well-known pioneering families of the town were Lewis and Ebenezer Jaclyn. Jaclyn. Who were they? I asked myself. It turned out that in an era when most Connecticut blacks were enslaved, these two men and nearly a dozen more members of their families were all born free and had lived and worked in Ridgefield for decades. And they had contributed to the community in different but substantial ways. In delving into the history of the Jaclyn family, I began finding other African Americans from Ridgefield. A few were free, but many more were enslaved, including two men who ran away from their masters. I identified 7 black men who had lived here and had served in the Revolution, all on the side of the Patriots. Then came the discovery that an elderly black couple named Uncle Ned and Aunt Betsey Armstrong had operated an underground railroad station, hiding fleeing slaves in caves on Ned's Mountain in Ridgebury. The very mountain itself had long been named for Uncle Ned, but no one in the past century seemed to know exactly why. Further research found that 4 people who had lived with the Armstrongs and at the Armstrong homestead, including 2 Armstrong grandchildren, had volunteered to fight in the Civil War. 2 of them died while in the service. A 5th resident of Ned's Mountain may have been a young man of color, a native of the Kingdom of Hawaii, who fought on both land and sea for the Union cause, and then became one of the famed Buffalo Soldiers in the West. Other African American men and women and the trials they faced in their lives kept surfacing as I examined town records and searched old newspapers. All this forgotten information about the black past seemed to cry out to be recorded on modern paper in the form of a book. However, undertaking this project has presented several problems, including the lack of records relating to African Americans and the difficulty in accessing some records because of the pandemic. However, a special problem is myself. I am a white man writing about black people. Try as I might, I will never be able to fully appreciate the enormous challenges that African American men, women, and children faced and the pains they suffered, be it as slaves, free farmers, soldiers, laborers, or operators of an underground railroad station. Nonetheless, I hope that this research will give people today and tomorrow some appreciation of the people of African descent who made their home in Ridgefield during the town's first 2 centuries. Now, what I'm going to do is summarize some of the highlights of what I found during this research adventure. And first, I want to just show you a map. I'm sure you all know you're in Ridgefield. That's what this is. And here we are down here in the center of town. That's Ned's Mountain up there. This is Ridgebury Road, Ned's Mountain Road, George Washington Highway, the road to the mall. And there's Ned's Lane, this little lane up off Ned's Mountain Road. And that's where Ned's Mountain is. Ridgebury Cemetery. And we will be mentioning New Patent. New Patent was a part of Ridgefield until 1846. It extended all the way up to New Fairfield. The town of Ridgefield was a very long town back then, from New Fairfield all the way down to Wilton. And that's where that's where Robert Jaclyn Jr. Established his farm. Down here in the lower part of town, down in the Flat Rock district, Samuel Jaclyn, his brother, bought an existing farm and expanded it quite a bit. So that gives you a general idea of the territory we're covering. Ridgefield was established in 1708, and enslaved people were living here by at least 1734, and probably much earlier. We know the 1734 date because that year Timothy Keeler placed this classified ad in the Boston Gazette and probably in other newspapers. Ran away from Timothy Keeler of Ridgefield in the county of Fairfield in Connecticut about the last of June, a Negro man named Mingo, a likely, well-grown fellow, thick-set, speaks good English, can read and write. One of his little toes is wanting. He is about 18 tiers, it says here, ironically. 18 tiers of age. He had on a good duroy coat of lightish color, a striped calaminio vest and breeches, good shoes and stockings, a plain cloth homemade greatcoat with brass buttons. He had, I am informed, a false pass, a pocket compass, and several books. Whoever shall take up this fellow and convey him to Captain Samuel Keeler at Norwalk in Connecticut shall have £7 reward and all necessary charges paid. Just a couple of things to mention here that when they say a likely fellow, that means a handsome, attractive person. The pass, in order for a black man, free or enslaved, to freely move around in Connecticut, you had to have written proof of who you were. And in the case of an enslaved person, you had to have permission from your master to be out off your property, off the property of the master. If you were a free black person, you carried identification to prove that you weren't enslaved so that they wouldn't arrest you. But this ad is remarkable as an amazing glimpse of a black man who lived 3 centuries ago. How many people fleeing on foot from a captive would bring books with them? The fact that he could read and write, something many white men and women could not do, suggests not only that he was quite talented, but also he may have been a secretary to Keeler, who was a prominent man in town and whose family would later operate the Keeler Tavern. Another enslaved man ran away from his owner in 1775. 2 things are noteworthy about the few records we have of Ishmael. One is that he was probably the first birth of an enslaved black baby documented in Ridgefield 283 years ago in an ancient quill-written record in the town, Ridgefield Town Hall. It says, Ishmael, a servant Negro boy of Gamaliel Northrups, was born July the 21st, 1739. Notice that he is called a servant. The term was the same as saying slave in New England. Any child born of an enslaved woman in Connecticut was also considered enslaved. So Northrop here was probably putting this on the record to notify everyone that this was a piece of his property. And you notice there's no mother or father mentioned. It's just the name of the baby, or the fact of the baby and the name, and the fact that he owned it. The second interesting thing is that in 1775, ads were appearing saying that Ishmael from Ridgefield had run away from his master. What's especially intriguing is that the ad says he goes by the name of Samuel Dimmerat. Dimmerat just happens to be the name of the first free black family to own land in Ridgefield. In 1736, an African American named Michael Dimmerat bought a little over an acre somewhere on the north side of West Lane or South Salem Road, then called Bedford Road, from Matthew Seymour, who incidentally was a slave owner and another prominent citizen. Michael also took the time to have the births of his children recorded in the Ridgefield records, probably in late 1736. Two may have occurred elsewhere, but Mary's October 29th, 1736 birth date is probably the first African American birth record here. Oddly, he does not provide the mother's name, or the town clerk just decided not to bother to include it. Nearly 3 years later, Dimmerat sold the same property back to Matthew Seymour with a big difference. When he bought it, he paid 10 pounds. And when he sold it, he received 22 pounds 10 shillings, more than double the buying price. The suggestion is that Dimmerat bought the acre as an undeveloped lot, built a house on it, and then sold it back to the man from whom he bought it. For what reason, I don't know. Dimmerat seems to have moved on, but it appears that at least one of his children, Mary, stayed here and late in life became poverty-stricken. So much so that another black family, that of Samuel Jaclyn, the farmer who lived down in Flat Rock, took care of her. But the fact that the runaway Ishmael took the very uncommon name of a free black family that had come here 3 years before he was even born is intriguing and could spark all sorts of interesting explanations that we won't get into here. I just want to point out that one other son, whose birth is recorded on the records, named John, fought in the French and Indian War from two colonies. He fought with the militia in New York, and he fought with the militia in Connecticut. And then when the American Revolution broke out, he fought with a regiment from Connecticut. So John Dimmerat served in two of his nation's wars. He wound up dying in an almshouse in Boston, which is the kind of end that many black veterans of the Civil War, of the Revolutionary War, came to. So far, my research has identified about 60 men, women, and children who were enslaved in Ridgefield in the 18th century, as well as about 25 free African Americans. At one point around 1755, Connecticut did a census. And the indication was that nearly 5% of Ridgefield's population that year was African American. And that's the highest percentage that has ever been, probably before, but certainly since. There are 12 pages of brief biographies of the 85 18th century African Americans in an appendix in the book Uncle Ned's Mountain. There are undoubtedly more to be discovered. Most of Ridgefield's freed blacks were descendants of Robert Jaclyn Sr., who was kidnapped from Africa in the late 1600s and sold to a physician in Boston. Robert Sr. bought his own freedom in around 1712, moved to New London, where he ran into some incredible racism when trying to buy a farm, and later relocated to a part of Norwalk that is now New Canaan. His son, Robert Jr., with his wife Anne, were among the pioneers who settled the upper New Patent, part of Ridgefield north of Ridgebury, in the 1740s. He bought a total of 70 acres that was just totally wild country, right on the New York colony line, somewhere north of where Richter Golf Course is in Danbury now. Another son, Samuel, bought a small established farm in the very south end of town. He had had a farm in New Canaan with his brother and decided to go off on his own and came to Ridgefield. His farm in New Canaan was closer to where he lived in Ridgefield than his brother's up in New Patent. We know more about Samuel Jaclyn than we do about any Ridgefielder in either the 18th or 19th century, because he became a substantial property owner, and when he died, he left a will. When that will was probated, an inventory of all his property was done. More than 400 items of value in 6 long pages, handwritten pages, this is just one of them, listing everything he owned. The will and inventory are a rare and amazing glimpse into the life of an 18th century free black farmer in Connecticut. He owned a farm as large as most Ridgefielders at the time, and he was possibly more varied than most in his talent, in his, the skills that he used to run it. He raised livestock and crops, had horses, maintained bees for honey, which was somewhat unusual for farmers back then. He made beer and cider, did his own carpentry, probably made his own tools. And he had a library of about a dozen books and pamphlets, including the Bible. Samuel Jaclyn was quite a religious fellow and belonged to the First Congregational Church. In all, his estate was valued at 533 pounds. That, according to one authority, is roughly equal to about $100,000 today, a really substantial sum for 1780 Ridgefield, which was really a place of general poverty. As much or more, it was as much or more than the average Ridgefield farm in the era. He left only 17 pounds in debts. I just want to point out here that although Samuel Jaclyn was a substantial farmer in Ridgefield, he was never treated as a real citizen. Although he owned much property and paid his taxes on it, Connecticut did not allow blacks to vote. That's taxation without representation, the same problem that was a cause of the American Revolution. Consequently, he and his brother Robert could also not hold office in Ridgefield. And back then, it was almost expected that at some time during your life, you would hold one office or another. It was kind of like volunteering for the community. But he couldn't do that because he wasn't a voter. Black men would not win suffrage until the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, 90 years after Samuel's death. Despite this second-class treatment, however, the Jaclyns contributed as many as 5 sons to the American Revolution's fight for freedom. A couple of them were with George Washington at Valley Forge. In all, at least 7 African Americans who had lived in Ridgefield and fought in the Revolution, fought in the Revolution, a war that began with a Declaration of Independence saying, all men are created equal. Yet when the war ended, none of these veterans nor any other African American would be treated equally with whites. It was while researching slavery in early Ridgefield that I ran across a 19th century newspaper article that shocked me. On page 8 of the July 7th, 1879 issue of Horace Greeley's famous New York Tribune was a letter to the editor headlined, Uncle Ned and Aunt Betsey. In it, the writer, signed only with the initial S, said that Uncle Ned was a man who devoted a life to an idea, the freedom of his colored brothers of the South. So well did he plan and execute that, to this day, near neighbors only knew Uncle Ned and Aunt Betsey as good, kind colored people, handy to have around to assist with the house or farm work. The correspondent continued, it was noticed that many colored men came and went, that officers often searched for certain colored men at the mansion, the word that the writer uses for a house, but never found them. No keeper of a railroad station was ever more faithful than the keepers of Ned's Mountain Station on the underground route from the South to Canada. Behind the house, the writer said, is a cave that furnished a hiding place and shelter for the weary liberty seekers. And there, Uncle Ned and Aunt Betsey supplied food and clothing until, rested and refreshed, under darkness of night, they would flee from this land of, quote, freedom to Canada. Even the existence of the cave, so well did Uncle Ned guard the secret, never became known except to one person, B.D. Norris, until after Mr. Lincoln had made all the slaves free. This is one of 2 different articles on the Armstrongs that I found strongly suggesting that Ridgefield had a stop on the famous Underground Railroad that nobody had ever publicized before. But just where was it? A good deal of digging through old records has led to the conclusion that the Armstrongs lived on the east side of Ned's Lane, off Ned's Mountain Road, shown here on an 1856 map. And you'll see where that red arrow is, there's a little black rectangle, and that's probably supposed to be their house or their compound. The census indicates there were 3 buildings there, but it may have been one building used by 3 families. The little lane today serves a couple of houses. That's not one of them. That's just a kind of a shack that's there, not very old. And it's also the back entrance to the old McKeon farm. now called Double H Farm, after its late owner, Hunter Harrison. Strangely, Harrison was one of the most famous railroad executives of the 20th century. No remnants remain of what was probably a little compound of 3 buildings that may have looked something like these. The land, by the way, is private property today and was once owned by Robert Durst, the millionaire murderer who died last month. He owned it while he was killing people. Ned's Mountain has long been called a mountain, but it's really just a nicely defined hill, reaching about 962 feet above sea level. That's the top of the mountain there. There's Ned's Lane, Ned's Mountain Road, Ridgebury Road, Old Stagecoach. This is the McKeon Farm, Double H Farm in here. I am told that Ned's Mountain has many caves of varying sizes, most of them well hidden. The Armstrongs may have used more than one. Here, viewed from Ned's Lane, is an example of one cave in the picture on the left, and then a close-up on the right that shows you how it's almost very difficult to see that there is a cave there. It's just a little crack kind of. Just where the cave or caves used by the Armstrongs were is currently unknown, but archaeologists might one day be able to detect evidence of 18th century occupation. Ned died in 1851 and Betsey 6 years later. Both were buried in Ridgebury Cemetery. However, the Armstrong family's contributions to the nation did not end with Ned and Betsey. 2 of their grandchildren, who grew up at Ned's Mountain, fought with the Union Army in the Civil War, and one was among the last Union soldiers to die in that conflict. He was John S. Smalley, who volunteered as soon as African Americans were allowed to serve in the Army. The federal government had banned blacks from serving until 1862, and Connecticut would not allow them to serve until 1863. Even then, African Americans were placed in segregated regiments, unlike in the Revolution, where the regiments were integrated. The Revolution was the last war until the Korean War. The revolution to the Korean War, in which there were integrated units in the Army. Their segregated units in the Civil War were, of course, led by white soldiers, white officers. The regiments were labeled to reflect that they were black. John Smalley was in the 29th Regiment Colored of Connecticut Volunteers, abbreviated 29 USCT, United States Colored Troops. The men of the 29th suffered other forms of discrimination. When Smalley enlisted, black soldiers were paid $3 a month less than whites and had to contribute to the cost of their uniforms, which whites did not have to do. They may even have been cheated out of the money due to them for their service. In a history of the 29th Regiment, Sergeant Isaac J. Hill described the inducements held out to men to join the regiment, including a bounty of $310 from the state, $75 from the county in which they enlisted, and $300 from the United States. The $310 from the from the state we received, he said. The other bounties we did not receive. Hill was an African-American who served as regiment orderly. He was also an African Methodist Episcopal minister. Because he was only 18 and an orphan, John Smalley had to have an adult approval to his enlistment. A white Danbury man named Starr did so, describing himself as Smalley's guardian. I have not figured out exactly what that relationship was, whether Smalley was an indentured servant to Starr or was just working for Starr as a kind of an apprentice. An Army regiment back then consisted of about 600 men. So many of Connecticut's African Americans volunteered for the Army that a second regiment, the 30th, had to be formed almost immediately. In 1860, 8,726 blacks were living in Connecticut, of whom 2,206 were men between the ages of 15 and 50 and eligible to serve. War records indicate that 1,764 men of color eventually served from Connecticut, an astounding 78% of those eligible. Of those volunteers, 15% were killed or died in the service. Only 48% of the eligible white men from Connecticut served in the war. Smalley was injured in the Petersburg-Richmond campaign, but recuperated, and after Appomattox, he was sent with the 29th to Texas to do some final policing there. At Fort Brownsville, Smalley came down with dysentery and died in what has been described as a hellhole of a field hospital, only 2 days before his regiment was ordered home and disbanded. His remains lie in Alexandria National Cemetery in Louisiana, in the heart of what had been slave country. John Smalley is not honored on any monument in what's probably his native town, but he does appear on the Civil War monument to African Americans at Worcester Cemetery in Danbury. His name also appears on the memorial to the 29th Regiment that stands in Cresculo Park in New Haven. Another grandson, John Watson, also joined the 29th at the same time as Smalley and saw similar service during the war. He survived, but what happened to him afterwards has not been discovered. No record of his life after the war or of his death has been found. After the Armstrongs died, their daughters and grandchildren eventually departed Ned's Mountain, and another family moved in. The Halsteads had been hands working on and living on farms in Ridgebury and North Salem since at least 1840. Prince Halstead and his wife, Mary, had several children, including sons Prince Albert Halstead, often called just Albert, and George Washington Halstead. Let me just, as an aside, mention that the name Prince was very common, or fairly common, among African Americans in the 19th century, and was supposedly reflected of royal descent from African royalty. Both of the Halstead boys enlisted in December 1863, as had the Armstrong grandsons, and they joined the 29th Regiment too. However, while in training in New Haven, Albert became ill and spent nearly 3 months in Knight General Hospital a military facility in New Haven. He was returned to duty April 5th, 1864, and died 10 days later of typhoid pneumonia. Incidentally, 2/3 of the 620,000 recorded military deaths in the Civil War were caused by disease, not by wounds. During its war service, the 29th Regiment had a total of 198 men, including 45 killed or mortally wounded in battle. They lost a total of 198 men, 45 killed or mortally wounded in battle. More than 3 times that number, 153 men, succumbed to disease. Again, there is no permanent Ridgefield recognition of Halstead, but he is listed on the Danbury Monument as one of the area African Americans who served in the war. The little cross means that he died in the service. Next to him on the monument is his brother George Washington Halstead, who not only survived hospitalization in New Haven, but also was later wounded in fighting around Richmond. His service must have been outstanding because he was promoted to corporal, and there's some evidence he was also again promoted to sergeant. He came home, married, worked on Ridgefield and North Salem farms, and died at a fairly young age. He is buried with most of the Halstead family in Ridgebury Cemetery. George's grave, of course, is the one with the flag, which is the only recognition that he has gotten locally. And I sort of doubt that the people who are very nicely put these flags in the cemeteries realize that George was African American. There's not too many African American soldiers buried here. The other stones in this line here belong to his parents, his wife, and his teenage daughter. One other Ned's Mountain resident who lived with the Halsteads was a man named Prince Romerson. Romerson today is well known enough to have rated a 4-page biography in the 2015 National Park Service book about Hawaiians and the Civil War. Without going into rather confusing details of the research involving many spellings of the family name, we believe the Ridgefield man was the same man described in the book. He was a native of the Kingdom of Hawaii who was living on Ned's Mountain in 1860. Hawaii then was its own independent kingdom. It wasn't until sometime after 1900 that it became a territory of the United States. After working on Ridgebury farms, Romerson joined the Union Navy and served aboard vessels that were blocking Confederate ports. He then joined the famous 5th Regiment Massachusetts Colored Volunteer Cavalry, serving in the Petersburg, Richmond campaigns and others, just like the 29th had. After the war, he became one of the Buffalo Soldiers, excuse me, a black American Army unit of mostly Civil War veterans who served in the American Indian Wars in the West. After he died in 1872 in Texas, he was buried in San Antonio National Cemetery beneath a stone that adds yet another variation to the many versions of his name. They spell it Rowerson. The M is upside down, actually. The more you dig around among historical documents like town hall records, old newspapers, and online archives, the more you seem to find. Aside from a lot of Civil War information, such as what I've already outlined, there were other 19th century discoveries, including the Riley family, perhaps the only land-owning African Americans in antebellum Ridgefield. In 1833, Lewis Riley bought a farm near the intersection of today's Route 7 and 35. Though he and his wife had only 2 children, one of them, George H. Riley, wound up giving them 9 grandchildren, thanks to his wife, Martha Ann Knapp Riley. This picture of Martha is the earliest known photograph of a black Ridgefielder and dates from sometime around 1860, according to the person who owns it and is a descendant. The Rileys led some hard and unusual lives. One grandson, David Riley, was duped at the age of 16 into helping the white son of a town constable steal a horse that belonged to a county sheriff. They were both arrested together. The black teenager wound up being sentenced to 3 years in state prison, 16 years old, while the white constable's son was deliberately allowed to escape and then fled the area in all prosecution. There was so much wrong with the case against David Riley that no less than the entire Connecticut state legislature voted to pardon young David, one of only 4 pardons the state legislature approved in 1878. In the second half of the 19th century, Isaac Hart Steele was among the few, perhaps the only, land-owning blacks. He had this modest home on Limekiln Road that is still standing. I'm sure it looks a lot fancier today than it did then, and I'm also pretty sure that we didn't have this birdhouse. In 1870, the year African Americans won the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, Steele became one of Ridgefield's first 2 black town officials. He and Thomas F. Brown were elected as Haywards, an old enforcement office whose duties included making sure farmers' fences were in good repair to prevent livestock escaping and damaging crops of others. It would be nearly a century before another black would serve in another major town office. In 1969, Dr. Clifford V. Smith, then an EPA official, was named to the Ridgefield Board of Education. Dr. Smith later became the chancellor of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee and a trustee of Johns Hopkins University. Not all 19th century African American history involved African Americans. On May 2, 1861, just a few weeks after the war began, the local pro-slavery, pro-South, anti-war Democrats, often called Copperheads or Dirty Heads, raised what was called a peace flag outside a tavern on Florida Road near Branchville. A Ridgefield man and his Hartford friend, who had just enlisted in the Union Army, tore down the flag. Both men were then shot by a copperhead who ran the tavern, or as what one pro-war Republican newspaper deridingly called a low groggery. Both victims survived, but the new enlistee was injured seriously enough that he had to be discharged from the service. I have found no evidence of the prosecution of the guy who shot them. In 1850, a 16-year-old Ridgefield native named Cyrus Northrop, who despite his age belonged to a local debating society, delivered a lecture before a large crowd in the town hall, the Ridgefield Town Hall, in which he argued in favor of allowing blacks to vote, a position that was not at all popular in Ridgefield or Connecticut, even after the war. That was really a brave thing to do in 1850 in Connecticut, Northrop would recall many years later, especially as citing one man who, quote, expressed himself in rather strong terms respecting my amount of cheek in making such an address. I do not suppose that there were more than 20 people in the audience who were in favor of Negro suffrage. Excuse me. Dr. Cyrus Northrop, who had been hired as a Ridgefield school teacher at the age of 15, went on to obtain 2 degrees from Yale and become the beloved president of the University of Minnesota for 26 years, during which time the school grew tremendously in size and offerings. A town and a mountain in Minnesota are named for him. There are many other stories of Ridgefield's African Americans to be discovered and told, including more recent happenings. A few unpleasant 20th century events are detailed in my book, Wicked Ridgefield. I hope to gradually update and expand Uncle Ned's Mountain as I find more information. African Americans of the past have made contributions to the Ridgefield community that have been all but ignored. It's important today, when there is so much friction and misunderstanding involving race in the nation, to promote a better understanding of the past that can foster a better understanding in the present. A good place to start is in one's own hometown. One way to do that is to incorporate some local African American history into the curriculum of the schools. It's important to have history or social studies courses examine slavery and race excuse me, on a national level, but local history should be a part of this examination. I suspect that many of our courses cover slavery in the South, but how many address it in the town in which the students actually live today? Ridgefield students probably learn about such celebrity events as the Battle of Ridgefield and visits by George Washington and Rochambeau, but they should also learn about the dozens of enslaved people who lived and toiled here, about how the town's only minister for nearly 40 years was a slaveholder, about the Jaclyns, who helped establish the new town nearly 3 centuries ago and whose sons went off to fight in the Revolution, about the Armstrongs, who aided people fleeing enslavement, and about the young men like John Watson, John Smalley, and the Halstead brothers, who, even though they were not considered citizens, served and in some cases died in the fight for the Union and against slavery. This is grassroots history, the recognition of a past that's not only close to home, but part of any effort to understand and improve the present. Thank you very much. Anyone have any questions? Yes.
We talk about the Underground Railroad. From Ridgefield, where was their next stop? Where?
Okay. Well, let's first say, where did they come from?
Yeah. Well,
Okay. Of course, none of this is documented because
all these routes were very secret. But in general, the Hudson River Valley was one of the routes that was used, including the river itself. Route 22, which still exists today, is a very old road. That was part of one little route. And at some point, many of the fleeing enslaved people would cross either into Connecticut or Massachusetts or Vermont into New England, where, except for Connecticut, they were apt to get much better treatment. And they may well have come kind of the same route that Washington used in going to Hartford, through North Salem into Ridgebury and stayed with the Armstrongs there. They may have come up the Norwalk River Valley. That's another possibility.
Thank you.
Again, it's uncertain.
Thank you.
From there, they could have gone to Milford and beyond Litchfield. Farmington was a big hub, big center in Connecticut. They may have made their way over basically along Route 6, lines up in Farmington, or goes through Farmington area. But, you know, that's just supposition based on, Strother has some description of these routes, but really doesn't recognize anything going through northern Fairfield County, not in Milford and southern Litchfield either. But it's quite possible that Milford was a place. Yes?
I once visited a house in Woodbury that was said to have hidden slaves in the basement. And I was wondering if anybody has actually plotted the route or documented the houses that are supposed to have been.
There's been efforts to document the houses, yes, but I have to say that a lot of the houses that are supposed to have places where fleeing slaves hid, it's questionable that people look for explanations for unusual rooms, or it's like a lot of these root cellars that the farmers built, you know, in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now they're Celtic caves. Some of them undoubtedly were used for that purpose. Some, it's just like Tory holes. I mean, a lot of houses claim to have Tory holes, and where Tories were hidden. I can't prove it. But, yes.
I have a question about Ned. He, according to your writings, he was bequeathed, you know, he was inherited by Sarah Keeler, am I correct? But who was, do we have any tracking of who is, like, could it have been Mingo? I mean, who was Ned's father? Because he just kind of shows up and she inherits him, but there had to be a parent.
There are a lot of babies born.
Yeah,
A son is born, and no names.
no name.
So,
she
could be one of
inherits
those,
the young boy.
But, you know,
But we don't know. The reason I'm asking is I've been on Ned's Mountain for 40 years, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the caves and the geography, but the old timers who are mostly gone now on Ned's Mountain, they insisted that one of the Neds, they thought there were two, that one of the Neds, so I'm thinking Ned's father, tended the cows when Washington came through, and that's what gave Ned and Ned's Mountain the notoriety was that generation, and then Ned Armstrong was the son. So this is just folklore, it's just what was told
Never heard of it.
on the mountain.
I've never heard of it.
And that's why I'm thinking, was there an original Ned that was around during the Revolution, and then the one that was inherited by Sarah Keeler was
No.
the son of the original?
That-
Again, this is just what
I've
the
tracked
locals said.
Armstrong, the name Armstrong in the censuses.
Yeah,
And believe, it tells in the book, I believe 1820 is as early as I've gotten.
Right.
And you know, the census is back to 1790 using names, so, but of course with black people, it wasn't, you know, sometimes they would just call him.
Because he just sort of showed up as an inheritance, but there had to be
Yeah,
something.
I don't know that Ned is the same Ned.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just interesting that somebody about the same age was a boy being inherited by somebody, and then later there was this older Ned.
Right. Yeah. Don't know.
And a document may surface someplace that provides more information and answer some of these mysteries. Yes.
Do you know what consequences people faced for participating or facilitating the Underground Railroad?
They could be arrested, put in jail, and some were. Connecticut was not a stellar state in terms of dealing with fugitive slaves. I think it was William Lloyd Garrison who called Connecticut the Georgia of the North. About, there have been estimates that the state was somewhat evenly split between people in the 1850s who were for and against slavery, or if not necessarily for slavery, would not oppose it. And one reason is that Connecticut made a lot of money off the South. The South supplied Connecticut mills with cotton that was used for making thread, for making garments, and there was a lot of that that happened in Ridgefield, or in Connecticut. And there were also other trade. Connecticut, having a big, long stretch of oceanfront, was involved in a lot of southern trade. And it didn't want to make enemies with the South. And that's why a lot of people in Connecticut, Democrats, opposed the war and opposed and wanted the war to end quickly. Yes.
The expression Underground Railroad, where did that start when there's no railroad? How did the expression begin?
It was, you know, just like a metaphor for describing the way something worked. I mean, you traveled a secret route from one station to another. And there was people at that station, either station masters or who saw to it that you got safely to your next stop. It was just a phrase, a way of describing. It was all very secret. There were no maps. It wasn't written down. It varied. It would change. The routes would change all the time as especially if they became discovered. There's some great books about this, about you could learn a lot about the Underground Railroad from, including a novel. What's the name of that novel, Sal?
Colson Whitehead.
Any other questions?
Yeah, actually, two questions. One, is there an explanation as to why only a couple of the names of Ridgefield African Americans who served in both the Civil War and in the Revolution are listed on town monuments? And then secondly, has there ever been an effort to engage archaeologists in examining the caves in the Ridgebury area?
I'll answer the second one first. No. Been recently, made public that's going on. And again, it's all private property. The first question was,
Why only a couple of the names of African-American soldiers?
well, let's take the Halsteads and Smalley. By the time they enlisted, they were living in Danbury and they enlisted from Danbury. But they grew up in Ridgefield. Smalley, I think, is a native. So, you know, to me, that means that, you know, his formative years were spent here and spent with some possibly very influential people, the Armstrongs. And I think that should be recognized somehow. But, you know, it's not like they were deliberately left off. They had a system for determining the names on most of these monuments, like the War Memorial. And some of the Jaclyns, at least one of the Jaclyns enlisted from New Milford, like he had grown up here, and then he had recently moved to New Milford. But I still consider them Ridgefields because they grew up here. They were born here. Any other questions? Yes.
Has your research uncovered any information about the dynamic that would have existed between enslaved Africans and freed or free African Americans here?
It's very difficult to do. There's what you would have to do pretty much is find a diary of 18th century life in Ridgefield. I'm unaware of the existence of any. And even then, it would have to involve somebody who had an association like that. It's very difficult. Based on what I've read about other communities, there would probably be some socializing, especially on Sundays. It might be in church related. I mean, a number, not by any means all, but a number of enslaved people did go to church. And usually in Ridgefield it would be the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church in Ridgefield, by the way, both in the village and in Ridgebury, was pretty open to black membership and had a number of black members. But there could have been some socializing, yes. You wonder, that's one of the problems that enslaved people had in places like Ridgefield. Ridgefield was a little town, only 1,500, 2,000 people. It was not very big and spread out, very rural. So if you were enslaved working on a farm in Bennett's Farm area or something like that, you would get very little opportunity to socialize with other African Americans, be they enslaved or free, because there weren't that many around. You just wonder how any kind of relationships actually could occur because of this separation. But it's interesting. In the book, I talk about one of a daughter of Samuel Jaclyn, the guy who lived down in south end of town, named Elizabeth, married a man who had been enslaved in Reading and fought in the Revolution, and because of his service in the Revolution was freed. He took the name Jack Freeman, which a lot of Connecticut blacks did, or a lot of black people did after they, I can't remember what his name was. Typically in Connecticut, enslaved people had one name. They didn't have a last name. Other areas, they took the names of their masters. And sometimes they did that here too, but single names seem to be what most of them had, and that's what he had. But he had sons who married people who were related to the wives, to the sons of the Jaclyns from New Milford. So somehow there were family get-togethers. This is while there's still slavery in the country, but this is after the enslavement in Connecticut was very rare, but still, there was socializing as far, people in Reading, or people in New Milford. It happened.
Okay, I think that's all we have for time. Thank you so much for coming out on this note. Thank you, Jaclyn.